Hi there.
Hello, friends.
How are we?
Getting my headphones set up. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yeah, okay.
Yep, we can.
Oh, perfect. I'm a little sick today, so sorry if I sound slow. Hoping to feel better later.
Oh no.
But we just got a small crew, so we'll be all right. I like your background, Donna.
Thank
Fitting
you.
right in.
I just moved to Springfield.
It's great.
You can also tell it's early morning and winter in Australia at the moment.
Yeah, Springfield, Australia.
We're all cozied up for a cold morning.
Yeah. Oh, it's not that cold. Just we're pretty we're not used to anything under 20 degrees.
Yeah. You're spoiled for the warm weather.
Yeah.
Well, I think it's just us today.
Okay.
And so we're good to go. We can have a relatively tight meeting and then roll from there. We might as well do, yeah, we are recording. So we'll do a quick intro for the benefit of anyone who catches the recording afterwards. Hey everybody, my name is Lee, leading the meeting.
My name's Brad Baker. I work for Atlassian and a maintainer on GraphQL Java.
Hello everyone, my name's Donna and same as Brad, I help out at GraphQL Java and I work at Atlassian.
Fantastic. And it's just the three of us, and we've already read the agenda, which means we got all the links to membership agreement, participation guidelines, etc. We can get on with business. Let me see if there's anything interesting to update y'all on from the primary meeting earlier in the month. Oh yeah, okay. It was a short meeting. There's actually an update to the agenda that I should have added to that doc that I forgot, which is relevant, which is the GraphQL Conf that is coming up later this year. I've just been encouraging everybody to submit to the CFP. And so if either of you would like to speak, I'd love to have you submit.
I've already put one in.
Oh, you did, Donna. You're
yeah, I'm trying to get the team to do it. Yeah.
Great. Fantastic. Well, either way, you should certainly encourage the team to get some tickets. It'd be awesome to have everybody come out. We're going to have an international convergence of GraphQL folks. It's going to be a good time. That was the major item that we talked to a little bit, mostly updates for me and some folks talking about what they're excited about for the meeting or for the conference. And then we of course went deep on incremental delivery. That's been the topic du jour for the last handful of primary meetings, which has been led by Rob Richard. He's really working through the last bits of chaos of what is hopefully not super complicated proposal in the end, but he's getting through all the corner cases. Important. Any questions on either of those? That's the major update. Cool. Otherwise, I see y'all added some agenda for us. Thank you very much. Maybe let's hit this in upside down order so we can just talk about the meeting time first, and then we can get into the spec wording stuff that you wanted to talk about. Yeah, meeting time. It seems like our respective daylight savings can do this, which makes the time zone overlaps wonky. 8:30 is a little early in the morning for you folks. Is that the main push here?
Yeah. I mean, I don't know who else is coming to these meetings and what time zones they're in, but if it is possible to move it by 30 minutes later, that will be easier for us Aussies.
Yeah, that seems exceedingly reasonable. I would say my constraint on the back edge of that is that at 5 p.m. my time, So right now it's 3:30 p.m. my time. So pushing it ahead by 30 minutes would make it start at 4 p.m. my time. I would have to close at 5. As long as everyone is okay with that. I think most of our meetings have cut short anyway, so I don't think that's going to be too big of a deal. But if there's ever a topic that went deeper, I might have to jump early. I'm gonna hand the meeting close to somebody else. But as long as we're okay with that being the trade-off, we can consider it plan. Cool.
Great, thanks.
I've got the June meeting coming up next month. I'll update the time for that one. And then it looks like I need to go add some agenda files for the next couple of meetings after June anyhow. So that'll just be what gets copied going forward. Spec wording clarification. Let's dig into that. I'm not sure which of you added it, so I'll let you, whoever added it, chime in.
It was both of us.
Okay. Or maybe, oh, this is an outdated issue that's Andy revitalized recently.
That's right.
Yeah, I think the gist was that the spec is currently unclear on whether it's valid to return both data and errors from a field fetch. And so some were arguing that ipso facto, if you have returned non-null data, then you must not have an error, kind of thing, right? And that was the position that I think is Benji were going for, kind of thing. And we're pretty strongly opposed to that. Namely, so in implementation terms, GraphQL Java currently allows you to return a sort of compound object from a data fetch, which is both errors and data. And we've got pretty strong sort of feedback that that's not only useful, but necessary for a bunch of people. So I don't think it's slightly accidental, is that people have continually come back and asked us for such a thing over the years, kind of stuff, which we added a while back and then have confirmed. Interesting, just little aside, we actually also allow other things like extension adding. So a field can sort of have a side effect of adding to an extension at the same time and so forth. But that's a different thing. But specifically on errors and data, our position is very much that errors and data should be allowed. You can imagine use cases. The kind of use cases we see is the sort of default values might be an example where you sort of say, I can't talk to the underlying service, but here's an appropriate default value. Very specific, but why not? You know what I mean? That kind of thing. So effectively information, informative error plus whatever. And we don't think it should be restricted unnecessarily by the spec.
If you hear me typing, it's because I'm taking notes. Okay, that's very helpful context. Thank you. I did not know the GraphQL lets you do that. That's kind of cool. So the first question here is about original intent. Original intent is definitely that it could do one or the other. The thought was you can kind of draw a correlation here between or to languages that throw. So like a function, either like JavaScript, even Java, a function either returns normally, in which case it returns a value, or it fails to complete normally. It completes abnormally via throwing. And then there's separate programmatic ways to handle each of those scenarios. Try catch for the abnormal case and just normal value delivery or value return into program execution flow for normal execution. So that was the mental model for GraphQL as well, that each field would sort of behave as one of those functions where either it completes normally, in which case it returns the type that it describes, or it completes abnormally, in which case GraphQL does this sort of like separate error bubbling behavior, where it works its way up the chain to figure out like where does it need to call a selection of the graph result in order to handle the error. So it's not just a matter of saying this field is null and is an error. Actually, the fact that it ends up being null is not because the field resolver said you should let this be null because there is an error. It's actually the result of the GraphQL executor itself determining where along the boundary can it cut an abnormally returning field response.
Yeah, so
that was the original intent.
Yeah, we do have that as well in our implementation. So in Java terms, if it's an exception, then exactly that behavior you were saying, right? It's like this accepted thing, and then we get into the whole game of it's implicitly going to be null now. Oh, by the way, is this nullable? And then we chain up the thing and so on according to what the spec says. But what we were against was this idea that effectively you could complete, let's call it successfully, right, and add both data and an error kind of thing, right? That would be implicitly banned by spec, right? So I guess in some ways maybe it's worth calling out the sort of exceptional path versus a sort of non-exceptional path, but data with error kind of style, right?
Yes.
It's a bit nuanced and it's slightly, it gets into gray areas of like a more functional language. If you were using ethers, you probably can't represent that as well and so forth. But in our case, we have a sort of fetch a result kind of thing that contains data, errors, and others actually. So yeah.
Well, you're right to point out that this is ambiguous. I think did not expect the scenario where the errors field or the errors section would contain anything other than caught thrown exceptions, to use that terminology, that like anything that is in that list is the result of that error bubbling behavior. And therefore you could have metadata like what field position was it that caused the error, and where you want to then bring it back into an IDE environment.
Yeah. So I think it's the most common and sensible case.
Yeah. So I think there's a handful of interesting paths forward, both in terms of like what would a recommended pattern be, and then also is there room to sort of evolve capabilities, or like what constraints do we want to put in place and what are the values of those? The first thing that came to my mind was, especially along the lines of the sort of parallel to functional programming languages, you would expect a functional programming language to return a compound type, like maybe they return a left, right, or either or, some kind of type, or like some kind of monad or something, where it encodes the fact that there's two possibilities or a combined set of possibilities, which the pro of that is now you're treating the error as data. It is in the payload itself. There's not like a side thing that you have to go looking for the errors. If a field in fact did fail to fetch correctly, and you're getting a compound result, you have both the error and the result in the payload. The downside being that you introduce this compound data structure. And if you're in a scenario where 99.9% of the time there's no error occurred, then you just created engineering toil for people who have to unwrap those things all the time.
Yeah. I guess our view is that if an engine decides not to provide it, then that's fine. Like, and it's the most sensible sort of position. But we will let's not ban it in spec. We could describe the nuance, but not ban it because the hammers
Mhm.
goes the other way, right? Which is to say, if the spec gets clarified and says there can never be anything else but data or an error, then it effectively, I mean, we would probably stay non-spec compliant for that thing, like, yeah, which we'd rather not, you know what I mean?
Yeah. Taking a note. Okay, so this is an interesting scenario. So essentially, this is evolving the direction of a proposal where the rough shape of the proposal is the currently at least intended way that we've stated the behavior is, excuse me, field either returns normally, in which case value gets added to response, or it fails because of an error, in which case the error is logged in the errors list, and then that errors behavior bubbles up until it finds the first non-nullable play sliced. And then it sounds like there's the beginnings of a proposal which says there's actually another way in which something can fail, which does insert something into the errors array, but does not create the error bubbling behavior. Instead, there's sort of like a localized catch.
Yeah.
Because I think another way we could say this is you could just put anything into the errors array whenever you want. And we could maybe do that. It makes me slightly nervous that maybe we're not thinking about some constraint that a tool has made an assumption about that will end up kind of diminishing the value of some part of the tooling ecosystem. So like, what's the...
Yeah, I can back you on the tooling aspect. So most front-end tools right now treat errors as a hard stop, right?
Yeah.
Like, so as much as, GraphQL sets out with the idea of saying you can have partial data and a list of errors for this set of fields, but not this. Most of the stuff I've seen out there just kind of goes, oh, there's errors, and they sort of hard stop. So in practice, for most clients, you're right that like the presence of an error is likely to just say this has stopped, right? But I don't know that the spec should outright ban it, because you could imagine errors with extensions that tell you that they're informative and that an aware client could decide to treat it, right? It's not sort of what the world does today, but why ban it, right? Like, why sort of say the presence of an error is always a hard stop? We already don't kind of want that. And so I see it that this is another example of that ability. You know what I mean?
Right. Interesting anecdote. The before open sourcing version of GraphQL had a lot more metadata around the errors. But they were just kind of very specific to Facebook's systems, and it didn't really make sense to include them as any part of a spec. But one of those metadata was, or I guess probably two of them, but that they were around this concept of, is it safe to ignore this or not? Like, is the error fatal? And the local tooling would actually decide that it always accepted partial responses unless one of those errors had the sort of fatal flag, in which case it would throw out the entire thing.
Right.
And then on the back end, the application engineers could decide if a particular failure scenario should result in stop everything about the query, throw the whole thing out. Which in hindsight was a little bit silly, because what they should have done is say, just don't deliver a payload, just deliver an entire error in an empty payload, which the client could then be agnostic to it, but that's not how it worked. And then the second one that was also really interesting was is this a transient error or not? So could you just try again? Because sometimes the error would fail because a database was unreachable.
Yeah.
And a database being unreachable is not like a permanent state. Like it's probably super temporary. And if you try it again in 10 seconds, it would probably work. You know, you'd get load balanced to a separate service as soon as the service got back into a healthy state. And that was also interesting. Like there are a handful of clients that eventually realized that if any error ever said anything about being transient, again, throw the whole thing out and just try it all over again with some exponential fall off. And if like you don't get one without an error in 3 tries, then just take what you get.
Yes.
And so it's interesting. Like I think there's like a separate bit here about what is good metadata on errors and client behavior that's underexplored.
Yeah, yeah. Well, actually,
Which
on
is
that,
maybe-
in Atlassian, we have a sort of quasi standard that we effectively use status codes, HTTP status codes, to indicate the sort of nature of the error. Right, we stick it in extension, and clients don't tend to act on it too much. But one other area that we do act on strongly is metricizing them. So people have built SLOs on the basis that I'm not getting these kind of errors in the experience that are 500 or better, you know, that kind of style. So there's another area where that error metadata feeds into the operational aspect of your system, which is, you know, it's quite good actually. Even if the client like didn't treat them in that way, right? So yeah.
Yeah, that's super interesting. I think it's really smart to use that as a piece that metrics it. I pulled up the spec. I was going to see what we have in the errors itself. Because I was trying to remember if we already supported this extension element to errors. I thought we had talked about that already. Because there's maybe kind of 2 things to talk about here. One is, do we have the right mechanisms in the spec for describing how to extend an error?
Well, there's I mean, we do in the sense that there's extensions, but there's no extended beyond that kind of, you know, which is tricky in the spec, but you can imagine a sort of, you know, in the same way something like WS GraphQL builds on top of how to talk it, you could imagine, you know, a quasi, you know, best practice error thing.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, you know, the problem is it gets into the domain of like, this is a good idea if your org is willing to accept it. You know what I mean? Whereas the spec would have trouble saying, thou shalt put this in and thou shalt call it status code and thou shalt have an error categorization or something like this, right?
Yeah. At some point, I would like us to do status codes. But I think the main way in which the status codes would be interesting would not be application layer codes. It would be GraphQL behavior layer codes. Like, is this a syntax error in the query? Is it was your something about your server broken? You know, it's like a 500 style level error. Was it a validation error? There's sort of like these different classes of errors, and then within each of those, there's like specific things that go wrong. And right now, I think people are like trying to parse the message text to understand which kind of error it is, which is not great, and also not great for services that want to internationalize those messages. And is one of the things that's blocking universal test automation. You'd really love to be able to say, put this schema and behavior into your service, and then we're going to just run 1,000 queries against it. And if you get exactly these shapes back, then you're spec compliant. And or at least you're spec compliant on the side of like, you haven't missed any functionality, like maybe you added functionality, but you haven't missed any functionality. And that's really hard to do with that, because like every service's error messages are slightly different, which is probably fine.
Yeah, and it would also metricize, right? Because it's not
Yeah.
your service's fault if someone throws you an invalid query. So that doesn't count against your SLO. But if you're not delivering data appropriately, then you should start looking at your service. So there's another aspect to those things as well. That would really deal with thing, and you can see it in Restian land, right, where middleware services just observe status codes and start tracking things for you and classifying you, and you're like, give me a count of the 500s, and they're like, oh, okay, someone's going to get paged on that, right? So
Totally.
Yeah, we're in that same world, which would be helped by that as well.
I agree. Okay, this is an interesting domain. So there's, I think, two branches that are coming from this. One is there's just the question of like, what was the original intent? I will write an update to that the GitHub issue that asked the question to just make sure that that one is known. And then second, I think there's like a whole domain of proposals to explore here that if y'all would be interested in exploring, we should certainly talk about. Everywhere from, should it be allowed to put something into the errors array when you have not created an error bubbling behavior? And if so, like, what are the constraints we want to put around that? Where you could imagine an extremely permissive version of that, which is just a sentence or two that says that you can just do it for whatever reason you want. But you can imagine a scenario where you put something into the errors array that describes some different field. Like, is that okay? Like, does it always have to come from a field so that the metadata can be correct? Like, what are other metadata that might be wrong if we break that assumption? So I think there's just like room to explore there to make sure that we've got behavior that makes sense. The status codes one is also really interesting, as well as the sort of not necessarily just the status code, but like behavioral flags of, I think for a long time, we've talked about this. What does it look like to have a fatal error that just hard stops the entire query? Like the response stops and does not return back, which is interesting for incremental delivery, because you can imagine getting the first bit of a stream completed and then having one of these fatal errors and needing to stop midstream. And so it would have some interesting effects on that.
Yeah.
It's entirely doable.
And
but
in your
incremental
delivery, you probably started to draw it, right? You've already probably started to throw it up. So what does it mean, So yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah. I know that they are exploring that to a degree, because at Facebook, they do have the concept of a fatal error, which is not exactly, I don't know what it means in terms of spec compliance necessarily. But it's a behavior that they have to figure out how to encode into that. Does that give us reasonable steps forward?
Yeah, I think so. We'll put our position on that issue as well, like as the GraphQL Java thing. Andy was a bit wishy-washy when he said 3 weeks. He was asking for clarification, but we've since discussed it, and we have strong evidence, like from consumers, that this is really useful. Yeah.
Cool. Yeah, I think it would be really helpful just to kind of capture the use cases, capture the constraints, and then propose what actually should be the boundaries, what's allowed and not allowed.
Yeah, sure. All right. Well, we'll put our what we do today stuff on it. Yeah.
Sweet. Okay. I'll capture the notes and write something up and post it there. I think that's our whole agenda, isn't it?
That's what we have.
So. Early mark.
That's right. All right. Cool discussion. Good topic. I'll let you both get on with your mornings. Donna, I hope you warm up there in Springfield.
As soon as the sun comes out, it gets warmer.
Yeah. Soon. Very, very soon.
All right. Get better
Hope
soon.
you
All
feel
right.
better
Stay
soon.
folks.
See you, bye.
Thank you. Thank you.